Welcome to the EX podcast, where I talk with business leaders, authors, and disruptors on how the workplace is changing. This podcast brings a different lens to the conversation around HR transformation, company culture, and employee engagement. It offers a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Why? Because companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talent. It is time we put people first to rehumanize the workplace, simply because leaders who don't care about their employees will eventually be surrounded by people who don't care about their business. Today's guest is Ken Oehler, Senior Partner, Global Culture and Engagement Practice Leader at Kincentric. Today with Ken we talk about what the new normal and the post-COVID-19 world means for business leaders and organizations, what this upcoming future of work means specifically to EX, and how organizations should be planning for this. What are the biggest challenges leaders and employees are going to face during this period of stabilization and recovery? What changes Ken believes will bounce back to normal, and what things will permanently change? What organizations need to do to keep their employees inspired, engaged, and connected during this transformation to the new normal journey through the ups and the downs over the coming months and year. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ken, and because it takes a good amount of time to produce this podcast, please make sure to review this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube, as it will help promote the content. If you want me to speak at your next events, get some advice on your EX initiatives, or send me feedback and suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at ex_summit. All right, let's get to it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the EX podcast. Very excited for today's guest, Ken Oehler from Kincentric. Ken, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Stefan. It's great to be here.
Tell us a bit more about who you are and what Kincentric does.
Sure. Kincentric is a Spencer Stuart organization. We are a consulting firm focused on unlocking the power of people and teams. We bring our clients a combination of people-centric consulting solutions, data-driven insights, and scaled technology solutions, all in the areas of culture and engagement, leadership, development and assessment, and HR and talent advisory. My personal role in the firm is I'm responsible for our global culture and engagement practice, and we focus on the strategy, assessment, measurement, and delivery of employee experience across the employee life cycle, really focused on unlocking culture, purpose, engagement from pre-employment assessment all the way to exit and all the moments that matter in between.
So now that we are exiting the lockdowns in many of the states and the cities around the country, and we hear everyone talking about the new normal and a post-COVID-19 world, what does it mean to you? What does this mean for society, in your opinion, and for businesses and for leaders? So let's start with what it means for you personally.
Well, I think the new normal, at least the new normal in the current state, certainly we've seen for my job and for my role and what we do, that has historically been very much dependent on travel, working together with clients, with our own teams. We've obviously moved to a lockdown world with almost no travel at this point, and mostly virtual work. So that's been probably the most significant impact on me personally. and the way work is getting done. And I think, many people around the globe share that. I think one of the other interesting things, being a father of two young kids that are now, my family is all now sharing the same space, and homeschooling is going on. And that's sort of a new area of work-life balance that I and many others around the globe are also trying to navigate at the same time.
What does it mean for businesses? What are you seeing as you interact with some of your customers? What impact has it had, or is it going to have on organizations around the world?
Yeah, I think there's been a couple waves. I mean, when we first saw organizations reacting and understanding sort of the growing and exponential impact of COVID cases around the globe, companies very quickly moved into sort of crisis management mode and shifting to virtual work and travel lockdowns and focusing on essential workers and things like that. And so I think that's at that point in time, and I think, and still, there's been a heavy focus on well-being, virtual work, making sure employees are okay, that the shift to virtual work, and particularly for many companies maybe that didn't do a lot of virtual work previously, that's been going okay. I think as the COVID crisis continues to unfold, I think the couple of things are clear at this point, is that what is clear is that the future is unclear, and that we will likely see some rather significant financial and economic impact beyond sort of the industries that we've seen already impacted so severely, like travel and leisure, hospitality, retail, healthcare, et cetera. I think we'll continue to see more business pressure from the demand shock that has occurred, and I think that will bring on the next wave of navigating through the change that goes beyond well-being and health experiences to the financial well-being and future look for some organizations.
It's been interesting to see how leaders have responded in many different ways to the situation, because no one has been trained for that. Obviously, it's unprecedented. No one really knew exactly how to react, but some were much more prepared than others, and looked up positively about potential outcome for the business and for the people, and others reacted more, I would say, reactively versus proactively. So from your perspective, how has it impacted leadership in general, whether in a good way or a bad way?
Yeah. Well, we've been doing many pulses with our client organizations over the last month and a half or so. We've just been pulling some data across some of these organizations. Hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of employees have weighed in. We had a point of view on the employee experience that matters and has mattered during this time being, and that has been really four areas. It's been around well-being. Are people okay? What are the stress levels, the workload levels, et cetera? Are people still able to connect and get human connection and caring from leaders, from their managers, from their coworkers? What has been senior leadership response? The decision speed, the communication clarity, and the rollout of changes that have been occurring so quickly. And then finally, the support for virtual work and new ways of working. What we've seen when we looked at this overall well-being concept, the level of stress, people feeling like the company's going to take care of them, their overall feeling of that the crisis is being managed well. Interestingly, the number one predictor of that employee experience has been senior leadership care and concern. And largely, what we're seeing in our data is that most leaders have really risen to the occasion at this particular point in time, in the April-May 2020 time period. roughly 8 out of 10 employees are saying that leaders have done a really good job. And I think what's been interesting about this, and people have been talking, and we talked to a lot of companies about, COVID is not just sort of a crisis, but it is a really important employee experience. It's one that will be remembered for a very long time.
Yeah.
And it also presents an opportunity for organizations to accelerate some of the things that perhaps they always knew were important and maybe were already working on. And that goes back to your question around leadership. And we've been talking about not just sort of skill-based leadership, but the style of leadership and leading with empathy and resilience and connection and caring. And this has really stretched some of those muscles for leaders. And I think the real question is, we've seen leaders step up in this extraordinary time and doing extraordinary things in this extraordinary time. I think the question will be for many organizations and for leaders is, how do you make that extraordinary the ordinary?
Yeah.
Things that we always knew were important. And how do we maintain that level of extraordinary human-centric outreach?
So let's talk about this a bit more then. What are the biggest challenges leaders and employees are going to face during these periods of stabilization and recovery?
Yeah, we've seen some similar situations in the past and have tracked employee experience, employee engagement, and perceptions in the past through things like 9/11 or the Great Recession. And many people know of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross change curve, or cycles of change, or cycles of grief, where you see sort of this immediate, actually positive spike, which some might say is Hawthorne Effect. And again, as I mentioned, we're seeing really pretty high perception scores on these pulses that we've been doing at this point in time. I think what we're also seeing in the data right now is that the number one concern is about workload-related stress, and is this really sustainable? So I think moving forward, it's very likely going through this change curve as people are adjusting to this change, to the loss of freedom, to the loss of certain levels of connectivity, to the ongoing ambiguity. I think it's likely that the employee experience will dip down, and that stress will continue. And if it's then compounded by economic stressors and crisis, that this will present a challenge both for employees to manage their own experience, but what we talk about leaders managing change, managing the depth and duration of what you might call the valley of despair as people go through that change cycle, and getting them on the other side to testing new ways of working and integrating new ways of working with whatever that new normal will be.
And I read an interesting article last week about employees being burned out, but for the first time, it was not because of work. It was because of everything else going on while they have to work from home, managing, school, homeschooling, financial stress, emotional stress. So it was not just work related; it was everything related. It's kind of a new burnout. What are your thoughts on this? And then how do you see organizations really focusing on better supporting their employees and their people through those very difficult times, knowing that, talking about the employee experience, they are going to have to cater the needs and the emotional states of different employees when we're trying to get back to a more normal workplace, whether it's a hybrid of working from home, working in the office, going back full-time in the office, or still working full-time remotely. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah.
Burnout, and then the sort of the customization of designing a more people-centric workplace for different individuals or different groups.
Yeah, completely agree. So on the burnout front, there was an article in Bloomberg, I believe, a few weeks back that said, on average, people are actually working 3 hours more a day with this virtual connectivity because you've cut out the commute time. We're doing more online meetings. more meetings than normal just to sort of manage the crisis, and the online video conferencing technology is allowing for very long days of connectivity like that, as you mentioned, that's sort of one of the stressors. I think the other thing we're seeing, and we saw this in the pulsing data that we saw when we ask about the stress, we see things, from the natural language processing programs that we're running on the comments, we see things like the workload, mental health showing up, managing homeschooling, managing the family pressures alongside of the business pressures. And what's interesting, and getting into that talent strategy piece and the segments and the moments, people in the age 35 to 44 zone are experiencing the highest levels of stress, and men and women are experiencing this differently. So as you might imagine, on average, more men talk about the stress of the business pressures of working out of a home office, maybe even some sort of the chair and the equipment monitors and technology, all these things are new stressors. Women talk about all those same things, but they talk a lot more about taking care of the kids and homeschooling as well. And so there's that age group is experiencing stress, but men and women are experiencing stress differently. And so there's a different employee experience for that, which is really elevating new concepts or concepts that have been around for a while in terms of diversity and inclusion, but really bringing that to the forefront in a pretty acute way. So that's some of the things that absolutely that we're seeing. This level of stress is going to be very tough to sustain, and so to the second part of the question, what companies are doing to manage this. I mean, we're seeing some organizations that are putting down some guidelines about how many meetings in a row you should be doing. Helping companies with or helping employees with apps for well-being and mindfulness and meditation. We actually asked employees sort of a crowdsourced question in these pulses about what have you done or learned, or what could you do to manage your own stress and productivity. And very loudly, we hear things like, take time off and go for a walk, manage your time wisely, make sure you're connecting with friends and family. One of the things that we know about stress and people going through changes is again, and the data confirm it, is the number one thing that people need when they're going through change is human connection. And so helping employees get that and to take the time out that they need and not just drive headlong into this sort of new normal without any support of managing the same stressors, a higher volume of those stressors, and then new stressors at the same time that include family and financial stress and uncertainty.
What are the things that you've been learning or still learning personally from this quarantine experience that you would like to carry forward into your daily life and business, and the inverse?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And this is, we talk to so many clients at this point about what is it that, or where are the lessons that we can learn that will accelerate. And I think that, two things in particular really jump out. One is, as I mentioned before, so we've been talking about senior leadership development around caring, compassion, resilience, EQ, a much more human-centric leader. And this has been a great lesson on the impact, the positive impact when leaders lead this way. We've seen many, many clients examples at this point where leaders have done amazing things. And if you think about the video conferencing technology, where leaders are inviting entire workforces into their living rooms or into their homes, and you see kids, and it makes them much more real and human and accessible, and the positive impact that we see from that. I think it's a lesson that all of us can take, sort of like, well, why didn't we do that so much before? And why wouldn't we just carry that forward? I think that's a huge lesson moving forward. I think the other one is for companies that have been talking about virtual work, and different companies are in different places on the spectrum of that, from they were already there with some pretty robust work from home policies and flexibility, to thinking that you can't really work from home, and really having a FaceTime culture, or a philosophy that the best innovation happens when teams are organically working together side by side, but now being forced into this situation of virtual work. And I think by and large, it's been working, and I think companies have been able to move forward. But as we've been talking about, certain stressors around that, and new guidelines and policies and ways to put up some boundaries so that people don't burn out, are going to be required.
And so on the opposite side, what are some of the things that personally you would not like to carry forward?
Yeah, I think balancing all of these stressors is going to be really pretty hard to sustain, and whatever the outcomes of the COVID crisis, I'm quite hopeful that at some point in the future we will have a vaccine, and getting to a new normal, I think, is very much vaccine dependent, and whatever the financial impact of all of this, if there is recessionary period or really significant downsizing for certain industries, we'll get on the other side of that too. But to be in sort of this sustained uncertainty from so many angles is very difficult. So, to the degree that leaders and organizations can provide some clarity, I think that will be needed. But I think I personally, and I think many people would say that the prolonged uncertainty is it's certainly straining and stressing levels of resilience and tolerance for ambiguity, and all the things we've been talking about navigating in a VUCA world.
So what changes do you think will bounce back to normal when everybody goes back to the workplace? And what are the things, or some of the things, that will permanently change?
Well, from our employee experience research that we've been doing over the last couple of years, and the conversations we have with clients, we know that the things that many companies and leaders want to get back to normal, or at least understand what the new normal is, are some of the really basic talent strategy elements and talent practices, thinking about high potentials and high performers, or the leadership pipeline, and what is the pre-hire experience for these people? What is the onboarding experience? How do you do performance management now? Performance management's been kind of thrown out the window. Looking back on 2019 and the first part of 2020, companies trying to think, how do we even think about performance in this context? And for companies to survive, they will have to really get back to thinking about what these things are, and the things that employees need to be engaged and motivated and have a great experience, which largely have to do with development, inspiration from leaders, enablement, technology, a great manager, recognition, et cetera. These things likely won't change. That will get back to normal as well, but I think it'll just be perhaps in a new context. I think some of the things that won't go back to normal for a period of time, I think just like after 9/11, people didn't really think about flying the same way again. I think people in crowded spaces, or even if you think about the real estate footprint, and how people greet each other, whether they shake hands, or if you're in a European society where 2 or 3 kisses on the cheek are normal parts of how people greet each other. I think these things will be very different. And I've seen some articles about real estate footprints that have boundaries and sort of behavioral economic nudges built into the floor plan so that people stay within 6 feet of each other, and how companies will plan for that in the future, and how people will think about commuting if you're in a larger city like New York or London or Paris, where you're taking subways or the tube or whatever public transportation. I think these things will be changed for quite a long time. And people will certainly be thinking about them differently. It's not just sort of like adding time onto my day, but it actually goes right to sort of the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs of personal safety.
Social distancing has been quite an interesting thing to watch, as people react very, very differently to social distancing. People embrace the fact that they can actually be quiet for hours in the day and really focus and be more productive. And others just freak out because they actually miss that social interaction, even though you can do some of it online and virtually, but it's not the same as a physical, presence or connection. Have you gotten any data out of the surveys that you've done on how people have reacted to social distancing in many different ways?
I think the thing that we're still learning is, one, I think it has a lot to do with expectations and how long people think this is going to last. I think we're already seeing in certain parts of the U.S., at least, where states are starting to open up again, sort of this mass rush to go back outside. I think largely people are social creatures, right? And they need to be around one another. Prolonged isolation is very difficult, even for the most introverted of people. So I think that we are seeing some different types of reactions from people, but I think what is clear is that people are getting antsy. I think when this all started, the thought of, well, maybe this will be 4 to 6 weeks, and then people will go back to work and go back to school. I think people thought it was manageable, but with sort of an unseen end date, our data is showing that people are getting antsy, and it is that sort of anxiety and the stress and prolonged social isolation that's pretty difficult to manage for many.
I guess I'm optimistic and maybe even unrealistic, or at least idealistic, in terms of building organizations that are more human-centered and people-centric. And I really believe, or I really hope at least, that moving forward, what we've gone through over the past few months is going to force leaders to rethink how they want to build their workplace of tomorrow. But the hard data may show something a little different. So what are you seeing right now about that sort of idealistic, more human-centered workplace, and what the reality may look like in the next few years?
I think there's a lot of energy around looking at these leadership behaviors that we've been talking about for a while now. I mean, some of the research that we published around engaging leaders, and meaning the leaders that are more engaging of others, and those human-centric behaviors around energizing and connecting and growth that really matter. This is, again, it's given a lot of organizations the opportunity to really put that into practice, because I think, as most people found, there was no other way to manage this. Leaders were forced to do this, and just even the little things, from when you would check in with meetings, and just the concept of the sort of the social niceties of asking, how are you, which used to not really mean anything. For this period of time, it's really meant something. People checking in and making sure that people were okay and healthy, and whether they were on top of each other from a crowded family situation, or people that were on their own and isolated for weeks at a time. I think that just the check-in, and the more frequent check-in, and a question, how are you, that was really meant was very impactful. It was a really important social lesson, a really important lesson for leaders. And I share that optimism that this is a moment of time, a moment of reflection. And during, there's a lot of research that says, people that go through crisis are whereas that's very, very difficult, these are sort of those metal forming experiences that make you a better person on the other side. And I think that the most progressive organizations are taking the opportunity to really reflect on this, think about this as the learning experiences for the next generation of leaders, how to accelerate toward a more human-centric, more caring culture. And so I share that optimism. And I think that the organizations that are really paying attention to this time will be better off. The ones that have managed the employee experience in a more human-centric way. Our research also shows from past crises that these are the companies that recover more quickly, that bounce back, that manage people through the change curve more effectively.
In your opinion, what do organizations need to do to keep their employees inspired, engaged, connected during this transformation to the new normal journey through the ups and downs over the coming months and year? What are some practical ideas or steps that organizations and leaders should take to create that, what's going to be that new workplace?
There's some things that we're already seeing happen from how virtual work meetings are conducted. Some lessons that have been in Harvard Business Review articles, like make sure you engage people in the first 60 seconds with some sort of activity. So it's not like a presentation, but it's truly a dialogue. Mm-hmm. Not talking for too long without re-engaging people with an activity. These lessons around how do you conduct an effective virtual meeting, I think is one of the things that we're seeing, and people are learning and testing new things almost on a daily basis. That's I think one area. I think some of the other things, like as companies start to go back to work, thinking about split shifts. Or, as we mentioned, sort of the change to the real estate footprint to manage work differently. I recently saw a video with Adam Grant, who was talking about some research from Anita Woolley around burstiness, and it's this concept of if you are in a virtual world and maybe spread out across work groups or geographies. That just the knowledge that people are working at the same time, so that if you're sending an email, that there will be some responsiveness, and the knowledge that you will get a response, and that you're interacting live with people, even though virtual, makes you more engaged and unlocks great creative ideas. So thinking about some rules and guidelines for how people interact in this virtual world. I think we'll see more and more rules and guidelines and rules of engagement around that, I think. And then in addition, crises are not fun for anybody, but they're also very powerful catalysts for innovation. I think we'll see some amazing new startups that come out of this. Mm-hmm. In the areas of virtual reality or tailored and AI-driven online learning that's customized down to the individual, things that will meet these gaps that were normally sort of human face-to-face driven, but will now need to be driven from a talent perspective in a more virtual world. I think we'll see some amazing innovations in the years to come.
So let me ask you some fun questions before we conclude our conversation today. What is the thing that you've enjoyed the most working from home during those past few months?
I think for me, I've really enjoyed it, even though that it's new and can be stressful. I've enjoyed being closer to my family, spending more time with my family. Whereas I travel a lot and am not home a lot, and then my kids were normally at school. I could maybe see them for a couple hours a day. now I see them more frequently and actually can engage in some of their homeschooling activities. And, that's been a real treat for me, having young kids and being able to spend more time than normal in these important years.
What has been the most challenging?
I think the next wave of economic uncertainty and the uncertainty on how long this is really going to be our reality, how long the COVID virus will be around, and if there will be a new wave of cases in the fall, and when we might see a vaccine or not see a vaccine. The uncertainty is very difficult. As we know, this is one of the things that leaders have been trained to deal with in sort of increasing volume and acceleration. This has been a lot and a prolonged level of uncertainty that it'd be nice to get a little bit more stabilization there.
What profession other than your own you would like to attempt?
I'm really an avid astronomy buff. I really love Neil deGrasse Tyson. Anything having to do with space and that area of science is absolutely fascinating to me. But I suppose increasingly, you might think about a medical profession too, given what's been going on in the last few months. To think about helping society through what is clearly a new wave and a new level of uncertainty to manage for society.
You mentioned that you travel a lot. What is your favorite city?
Oh, I have a few. I'm partial to Rome. I really like Budapest quite a lot as well. I live in the New York area, so I do love New York. You probably see a bit of a theme of larger cities, metropolises that I tend to like quite a lot. Shanghai is pretty special too. It's a very cool city.
What turns you on?
Learning and curiosity.
What turns you off?
I suppose the opposite of that, closed-mindedness and people saying, well, we can't do that.
If you were to invite a historical figure to dinner, someone famous, who would you pick and why?
I'd really like to spend some time with the Dalai Lama. I think, lessons of compassion and mindfulness are more important than ever. And I think he's got a lot to teach us.
What's the way for listeners to follow you and Kincentric on social media?
Yeah, so you can find us on Facebook, Kincentric.com, Kincentric.com, and reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'd love to connect with anybody on LinkedIn in particular.
We'll share all of those on the podcast notes. Any last word of wisdom or advice for our listeners?
I think as it pertains to employee experience, the lesson we keep learning about navigating through change and uncertainty is connectivity, human connectivity. That's something leaders will need to manage moving forward, and for people managing their own well-being, reaching out and making sure you're connecting with others, coworkers, friends, colleagues is going to be really important and more important than ever as we navigate through into the other side of this crisis to a post-COVID world.
Well, thank you, Ken. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, Stefan. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at eXpodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.